Hi, welcome to Superstory Games. My name is Daniel, and today we'll be covering the differences between video game genres and the subcultures that surround them. The first genre I'll be covering in today's video is the action genre. The action genre requires hand-eye coordination and reflexes to overcome physical challenges. Pac-Man and Frogger are old examples of an action game. In Pac-Man, the player has to make quick and decisive moves to avoid being caught by incoming ghosts, and in Frogger the player must rely on their reaction times and reflexes to avoid the vehicles that are moving in the player's direction. When most people think of the action genre, they often assume that the adopted games are fighting games or something with melee combat. The unnerving truth is that video game genres have the ability to evolve from the parenting games. The action genre is a parent genre. It directly inspired genres to build off of it, and I'll be explaining all of them now. Arguably one of the most famous video game genres of all time, platformer, is an example of an action game. Games in this subgenre are cast down by hardcore gamers because of the childish notion that surrounds them. A large proportion of gamers were introduced to the platforming subgenre by the giants known as Nintendo and Sega with their Super Mario and Sonic the Hedgehog games. The notion of childish fun derives from these games as they are experienced by the now adult gamers when they were much younger than they are now. Games within the platforming subgenre often task the player with traversing a two-dimensional environment, whilst they climb terrain and avoid obstacles. It's not unheard of for the three-dimensional platforming games to exist. I merely mention that the frequency of such games is much smaller in comparison to their 2D counterparts. Some examples of 3D platforming games are Knack, Snake Pass, Banjo-Kazooie, and the average age of a platforming game player is usually below 11 years of age. The shooting subgenre of the action genre is the most popular game genre to ever exist. Whenever online polls or voting forms are available, the shooting genre is atop of everything else in value. That is because a lot of people misinterpret the meaning of the shooting genre. Anything that allows the player to shoot a weapon is classified as a shooting game. One good example would be the famous video game for the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1987 called Contra. Contra is a hybrid game, which is something I will go into more detail later on in the video. For now I'll give a short synopsis to prove my point. Contra is both a two-dimensional platforming game and a shooting game. Contra twists the shooting subgenre by collaging with something else. An example that exclusively adopts the shooting subgenre is Space Invaders. Hopefully I need not explain the premise to Space Invaders, but for the 0.1% of people on this planet that do not know what Space Invaders is. It is a game where the player attempts to defend their small settlement by shooting at a vertically advancing set of aliens with a tank. The shooting subgenre is a parent subgenre. This means that the first-person shooting subgenre is a grandchild to the action genre. Within the first-person shooting subgenre, the player is tasked with witnessing the game's world from the eyes of the in-game character. First-person shooting subgenre is a giant at the moment, with most gamers having played at least one in their lifetime. Some examples of popular first-person shooting games are Halo, Half-Life, 007 GoldenEye, Doom, and Wolfenstein. Some people refer to the first-person shooting subgenre as an alphabet genre because it abbreviates to FPS. One common trait of the first-person shooting subgenre is the inflated age ratings adopted by these games, often being for late teenagers and above. The average age of a first-person shooter player is 22 years of age. Most of the players have jobs and they turn to online first-person shooters for 1 or 2 matches a night. It's either tradition or something to look forward to at the end of the day. My very own father is also a gamer, often tuning into Battlefield 1943 to blow up some tanks on the islands of Iwo Jima before bedtime. The third-person shooting subgenre is a subgenre of the shooting subgenre, which is in turn a subgenre of the action genre. Almost a tongue twister, I know. Games within this subgenre are sometimes mistaken for over-shoulder view games. Either name is correct. A typical third-person shooter shows the game from an outside source, watching the character, often from over their shoulder. The age ratings of third-person games are often a little more relaxed than their first-person relatives. An example of this would be Star Wars Battlefront, the good one, which has an age rating of 12. The next subgenre of the action genre is the fighting game subgenre. Fighting games often have a competitive arena for players to compete in a one-on-one duel. These games often include violent and unarmed attacks, in addition to a large cast of characters for the player to choose from. These games can either be in 2D or 3D, although the former is usually the preferred option. A popular example of a fighting game is Street Fighter 2. Street Fighter 2 has a large cast of characters and an easy to learn, hard to master combat system. Another example of a fighting game is Super Smash Bros. For the Wii U. This game has a large cult following, where players from around the world will play the game at tournament level for real world money, because of its skill-based reward system. An example of a 3D fighting game is Mountain Blade Warband. This game you can outfit your character with armor and have him duel with other participants in combat. This game allows you to do what other fighting games cannot. It gives the player full control over the sword's movement, as the player has to swing their sword using the mouse. This also means the player has to block and parry in the direction they believe the sword is coming. Players of this subgenre are most likely young adults looking for a competitive edge and a good time with their friends. Brawler games, sometimes known as the beat-em-up genre, is a subgenre of the fighting game subgenre. The main difference here being that the players of the brawler genre face large waves of opponents on their own instead of facing a single person. An example of this subgenre is Streets of Rage 2, which is arguably the most recognisable example of this subgenre. Sadly, this subgenre is nowhere as popular as it once was, with only a few remote examples continuing to this day. Some modern examples of beat-em-ups are Castle Crashers and Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. To some people, Metal Gear was the very first stealth game to exist. The stealth game subgenre usually has the player avoid conflict with opponents instead of going head-on and destroying an army. The subgenre remains as a popular influence for many games designers as studios attempt to hybrid the stealth subgenre with other genres. A popular example of this would be the Dishonored games. In Dishonored, the player can sneak around an environment for an easy playthrough. They can equip their swords and attempt to slice through every foe who stands before them for a more interesting and difficult playthrough. Many more games use the stealth subgenre and introduce stealth mechanics into their games as an option, but very few go all out and make it the main mechanic. A modern day example of a stealth game would be Sniper Elite version 4. In this game, the player maneuvers around a Nazi-occupied Africa, sneaking around enemy convoys and distracting incoming guards. Games that exclusively adopt the stealth genre don't particularly do too well on the market, but games that offer stealth as an option seem to sell more copies. People who play stealth games are for the most part nostalgia gamers, trying to find the enjoyment they once had playing Metal Gear when they were younger. Survival games are social games. Games within this subgenre often throw the player into an open world, where they need to find edible items to maintain a healthy hunger bar, in addition to surviving whatever the game's world throws them. A common trait of survival games is online connectivity. In online survival games, the player must also find a way to survive against other players, in addition to any animals or creatures found within the world. It should also be known that not all survival games have online play, but a fair amount do. Some popular examples of survival games are DayZ, Unturned, Dying Light, and The Forest. 3 of those examples feature zombies. A large number of survival games feature zombies. They're a pretty common trait of the survival subgenre. Rhythm games often require reflexes and pure skill to match notes and tune of a song. An old school example of a rhythm game is Guitar Hero. This game the player holds a special guitar-shaped controller and pushes buttons that correspond with the on-screen colours, mimicking the movement of pressing chords on a real guitar. But a popular example of a modern rhythm game is Beat Saber. In this game you hold 2 motion-tracked controllers in a virtual reality setting and swing 2 lightsaber-like weapons in the direction of incoming blocks to the sound of music. I don't own the game, but I do find it interesting to watch people play this game. The mix between graceful movement and the energetic swings as the players rely entirely on reaction time to hit the boxes as fast as they can. To conclude the action genre, I must state that the reward system is not particularly relevant. The player is rewarded with the next level if they complete a challenge. Very rarely do they get given anything of actual worth. In first-person shooter games, the player may get rewarded with a new gun, that in most cases holds a brand new appearance with very similar stats to the previous one they were holding. Adventure games Our games are a gripping story. They aim to capture the chaos of film and transfer it to an interactive environment where the player can pretend to be the character they control in game. One of the first widely recognised examples of an adventure game is Pitfall for the Atari 2600. Adventure games rarely put pressure on the player, often allowing for a casual, carefree experience. Similar to the action game genre, the adventure game genre also has subgenres. The earliest example of an adventure game is Colossal Cave Adventures. Colossal Cave Adventures is a text-based adventure game. When the game was made, the creators were limited to a couple megabytes of storage, so instead of creating some fancy beautiful landscapes for a game, they decided to describe everything using text instead. Some examples that popularized the text-based adventure game subgenre are Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and Zork. Both of these games aim to tell a story through the text-based gameplay. In this subgenre, the player is treated with what could best be described as an interactive novel. They're given paragraphs and paragraphs of text to climb through, and similar to a board game known as Dungeons & Dragons, the players can decide what they want to do and do it. These games don't tell the player what they can do, and they also don't tell the player what they cannot do. So the player has to use their creative muscles in addition to intuition to explore avenues and complete the narrative. This subgenre is much more popular with female gamers than males, but the genre is very close to extinction because only a few examples come to mind when I reflect on the past 5 years. The typical audience for a game like this are female casual gamers looking for something to do as they take public transport. Another subgenre of the adventure genre is the graphic adventure subgenre. This subgenre is very similar to the text-based adventure subgenre, with the only difference being that images are used instead of text. The next subgenre of the adventure subgenre is the point-and-click subgenre. Games within this subgenre often have the player left-click to move their character as well as interactive objects and talk to non-playable characters, often abbreviated to NPC. This subgenre aims to tell a mostly linear story that in most cases matches the epic scale of films seen on the big screen. Some famous examples of point-and-click games are The Curse of Monkey Island, Grim Fandango, and Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis. Unlike the text-based adventure game subgenre, the point-and-click subgenre seems to be popular today. One of my favourite point-and-click games to date was made in 2014, and it goes by the name of Gods Will Be Watching. This game is linear and does not allow much wiggle room when it comes to derailing the plot. The character can die in one chapter and can be alive in the next one. This game is nowhere near perfection, but it lets the player choose how they do things. In one of the chapters that actually matters, the player can choose who lives and who dies by waving a gun around to scare people. The target audience is for people who play the point-and-click subgenre or indie gamers, people who seek games made by passionate people. These people will either look past the flaws or scrutinise them, so be careful. Visual novels are a common narrative telling device found in Japan. Many games have spawned from the subgenre of the adventure genre over the years, and some notable examples are Steins Gate, Fate Stay Night, and Doki Doki Literature Club. These games require minimal input, with a majority of interaction being dialogue choices. Games in this subgenre often hold the aesthetic of Japanese manga. I consider visual novels to be very linear interactive comic books. The demographic for visual novel users is males from aged 18 to 30, with only 30% of women saying that they actually enjoy visual novels. Interactive movie games have increased in popularity over the past few years. Games in this subgenre are very much like the title suggests. They're films with interactive elements. The player's input in an interactive movie game varies on the developer. Sometimes the player can walk around, and in other cases their input is narrowed down to a few dialogue choices. One example of a recently released interactive movie game is Detroit Become Human. This game tells the story of 3 different characters and how their lives become entwined. The player is given choices to make, and like a choose-your-own storybook, they happen. People who play interactive movie games are usually between the ages of 16 and 30. To conclude the adventure genre, I'd like to mention that rewarding players isn't something that happens far too often. If a player explores the game and locates a secret, they're often rewarded with a joke left by the developers. Role-playing games aren't at the top of the video game food chain, they're pretty goddamn high. This genre is often abbreviated to RPG because of how easy it is to say. Games from this genre take massive amounts of inspiration from the Dungeons & Dragons board game from 1974, which is arguably one of the most influential games to ever existed. Period. Games of this genre often have the player managing stats, e.g. strength and magic, in addition to the stats of their weapon. Whenever a player defeats an enemy, they gain some experience points, and when their total reaches a certain number, their in-game level increases, allowing the player to increase their character stats. Role-playing games often have a metagame of managing these stats as well as fighting the in-game characters. A famous example of a role-playing game is The Elder Scrolls V, Skyrim. In Skyrim, the player can do whatever they want. They can further the main plot if they so desire, but they also have the ability to explore the world and climb mountains. Role-playing games are often seen as a form of escapism, as the player role-plays as the character they've created. Role-playing games are often played by people of all ages, as the ages of maturity of games in this genre change depending on the title. One of my favourite role-playing games of all time is The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, which is at 12. One similarity between the titles is that people who play these games play them to immerse themselves in the worlds of the game. A subgenre of the RPG genre is the MMORPG genre, which is another alphabet genre. This genre is narrowed down to the 6th letter because it is much easier to search the internet for MMORPG than massively multiplayer online role-playing game, which is indeed a mouthful. Games in the massively multiplayer online role-playing game subgenre always feature online connectivity. MMORPGs are very similar to role-playing games, with the only difference being that you're playing alongside other players. The player can still do quests and explore the world, but only this time they face the danger of an actual player instead of some pre-coded bandits. A lot of these games have the player pay a subscription instead of a one-time fee. A popular example of an MMORPG is World of Warcraft. Roguelike is a genre that once existed as a role-playing game but branched out and formed its own genre. Rogue is a game that was created in 1980 for the Atari 8-bit. This game shows some elements of a role-playing game but has a primary focus on randomness, with every time you play the game showing you something brand new. This game genre became popular when indie developers started in their attempts to replicate the success of Rogue, the genre itself being called Rogue because it was like Rogue. Roguelite is a subgenre of the roguelike genre, the main difference being that the game drops the role-playing management systems and focuses on other avenues like combat and literally anything else. An example of a roguelite is Spelunky, and another is Cave Blazers. People who play these games are often 14 to 22 years of age, and they're looking for a challenge, as games in these genres often have the player start from the very beginning when they die. Another game genre that spawned as a direct response to a video game is Souls-like. Games in this genre are often described as like Dark Souls. Dark Souls holds the role-playing game management systems, but has a deep emphasis on difficult combat, and the player needs to consciously think through every single attack they make. To conclude the role-playing game genre, I'd like to mention that reward systems are rich in this genre. Whenever a player kills enough foes or completes enough quests, the player levels up. They can use skill points whenever they level up to increase character statistics. It is also common for the player to get brand new equipment, e.g. swords and armor, from completing quests. The next genre is the driving and flying genre. In this genre, the player is given either a motorized vehicle or something with the capacity to fly. The frequency of games in this genre has begun to dwindle over the years, but that doesn't mean people don't play them. Forza Horizon 4 is an example of a popular racing and flying game. This game released on the 2nd of October 2018, and it allows the player to drive freely over a portion of the United Kingdom. Games in this genre rely heavily on vehicles. The player either drives or flies across a world competing against other opponents, sometimes players and other times non-playable characters. Most of the games in this genre hold an age rating of 3, and that is the reason why they're so popular among children. Strategy games are popular. Yep, I stated the obvious. Chess is a strategy game, and so is StarCraft 2. In strategy games, the player manages multiple units on screen, triumphs over armies using tactics and their wits. The subgenres for a strategy game are turn-based strategy games, real-time strategy games, and real-time tactic games. Turn-based strategy games are like the name suggests. The player makes a move and then waits for their opponent to do the same. Real-time strategy is when both players move their pieces at the same time. And a real-time tactics game is very similar to the real-time strategy game, with the only difference being that when a unit is dead, it stays dead. There are also different types of strategy games. Battlestar Galactica Deadlock is a space strategy game, and Halo Wars is a more traditional strategy game. Strategy games don't reward the player in a physical sense, instead they allow the player to feel a sense of pride and accomplishment after they defeat a foe. Puzzle games are either loved by people or hated by people. Tetris is a nice relaxing game that has the player stacking blocks to clear layers and gain points. Some people see this game as a fun use of an hour, and others see it as beneath them. If you're creating a puzzle game, you're better off targeting it to casual gamers, people who occasionally play games instead of people who play for hours every day. Typical reward systems in these games include the player increasing their high score and being able to brag to their friends. There aren't any serious subgenres of the puzzle genre, but there are different types of puzzles that you can find within this genre. Action puzzles are real-time puzzles that have the player plan things out and see the results as soon as the inputs are made. For example, in The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, the player can interact with the Divine Beasts. These Divine Beasts are giant puzzles that the player has to interact with using their Sheikah Slate. Another example is a physics puzzle. Physics puzzles often have the player relying on gravity or perspective as they look around an environment. Games that feature physics puzzles usually have a detailed and realistic physics engine. The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild also uses physics puzzles. In this game, the player can use their Magnesis rune to pick up metal objects and move them around. There are many different types of puzzle, but they're the only two I'm going to mention. Sports games are popular among children and some young adults. It allows them to run their fantasies of being a team manager for their favourite sports team. The typical controls involve the player switching between different characters in-game. A popular example of a sports game is Electronic Arts' FIFA series. In FIFA, the player manages a team, choosing their favourite real-life players and matching them up into their very own ultimate team. Reward systems in these kind of games usually give the players some new characters to control. Some examples of video game genres that I have not covered in this video are Bible games, party games, mobile games, educational games, exercise games. What I will be covering, though, is the hybrid genre. The hybrid genre is the combination of multiple genres to form something new. An example of a hybrid genre is Rocket League. It combines the sports genre with the racing and flying genre. Kingdom is a game that combines the platforming subgenre with the strategy genre to create something truly unique. Super Smash Bros. For the Wii U combines the platforming subgenre with the fighting subgenre to create a fighting game faster than most. Super Hot combines the puzzle genre with the first-person shooting subgenre to create one of the most mechanically different games of this decade. Hybridization of video game genres is what keeps things fresh. People are slowly beginning to turn bored of playing similar games every year. When you've perfected the first-person shooter genre, other games are going to steal the formula in attempts to replicate the success, but in doing this, the consumer is playing the same game with a different coat of paint every year, which results in boredom beyond imagining. So designers are forced to show creative resilience as they build brand new worlds. If you intend to create a game, it would be best if you hybridized it. That'll be all for today. Thanks for watching. If you have any comments, please leave them below. Adios.